Welcome to the Triage Method podcast. As always, with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. How are you this week, Paddy?
I'm positively fantastic today, Gary. I'm watching my garden outside and it is pissing rain, but the sun is still out because we live in Ireland. Anyway, what are we discussing today?
Yeah, so this week's topic is definitely a more kind of meta topic that is related to how we think about standards of evidence, you could say, but particularly applied to personal training and also the information that's kind of put out in the health and fitness space in general. Because one of the things that I've come across is the fact that people really do struggle to decide who is reliable and who is not reliable when they're deciding whether or not they should follow people. And for some reason, people tend to ask me or us fairly regularly, hey, what do you think of this person's content? Or what do you think of this person's content? Or what we might see is people will tag us in some sort of story and say, oh, these people are the best to follow, and it will be us. And then maybe some other people who we're kind of like, God, like I don't know if our content very much aligns with what they're saying at all, and those sorts of things. So from seeing that kind of discrepancy in terms of how people assess the reliability of information, and from kind of my own observation in terms of the way that different people online put out information, the different standards of evidence that they have, we wanted to kind of tease out some of the details there. So that all sounds quite vague, but basically earlier in the week, I made a post on my personal Instagram, and it was titled Navigating the Evidence-Based or Science-Based Spectrum. And the reason I call it a spectrum is because different people have different standards for what they consider to be science-based. And while we like to think that, oh, science is science, and, you know, this is what the science says. And, you know, I recently heard a doctor say, the facts are the facts, and these are what the facts are. It actually runs a lot deeper than that, because fundamentally, people have different philosophies for the type of information that they consider to be reliable. And you can certainly argue that there is a hierarchy there. And one of the big kind of, the way that I would dichotomize this, if you think of the two ends of the spectrum, would be the conservative person and the liberal person. And they're not the terms as used in American politics. They're kind of related, you could say. But the conservative individual, when they're encountering scientific information or evidence, or they're on PubMed looking for research papers, they're unlikely to come to a conclusion or a decision made unless there's rigorous evidence. So generally you're looking at multiple studies, or at least really well-designed studies that demonstrate efficacy. So efficacy being the intervention works in an ideal research-based setting, and effectiveness that the intervention works in kind of a real-world setting, so in practice pretty much. So they're unlikely to run forward with an intervention unless we have that evidence to say that this actually works in real people in the real world. That's what they're looking for. That's what the conservative is looking for, because they're not going to run and try to change things unless they have evidence to show that there is merit to doing so. However, the more liberal individual, they might look at science and evidence and say that, oh, look, based on, let's say, this metabolic pathway or something, it seems like this intervention might be helpful. So what they're doing is they're looking for plausible mechanisms that would make something useful without direct observable evidence, like the other individual, the conservative, who wants like rigorous evidence in the real world. So they're kind of willing to say that this might work based on these mechanisms, so I'm going to go ahead and make that decision. And as we kind of reflect on those two different ends of the spectrum, what I want you to note is that neither is inherently better than the other, because there are cases where you want the conservative to be making most of the decisions. You want to be quite conservative when you're making public health policy, let's say, in a lot of cases, okay? Because you want to be able to say to people that if you put these interventions into practice, I'm very confident that this will have a meaningful effect. You're not just saying, oh yeah, here, everyone in the population eat this specific food because it would kind of maybe make sense based on physiology or biochemistry that this might be healthful. We want more rigorous evidence than that. However, there are actually examples, even at the level of public health, where you actually might want someone to be a little bit more liberal. And an example of that would be COVID-19. A lot of the public health policy related to COVID-19 has been like so much, there's uncertainty baked into the cake. No one could say for sure, what will universal mask wearing in the Irish population, how will that affect viral transmission? No one can exactly predict how that will affect things in advance. But in that case, what you do is you say, okay, what are the benefits and what are the harms, or potential benefits and potential harms? And if there are potential benefits in the absence of significant potential harms, then it's easier to go ahead and make that decision without the rigorous evidence that you might have for other interventions. So you can see there that because there's an asymmetry between the benefits and harms, it's easier to make that decision. However, if it was a drug, you wouldn't just put a drug or a vaccine. Like the vaccine is probably the best example. You wouldn't put a vaccine out into the population because, it makes sense that this might be safe, because very clearly we would anticipate that there would be greater potential harms to an untested drug than there would be to a face mask. So even in just looking at those examples, you can start to see that just simply looking at a research paper, or you see people online sharing research papers, that's not enough to actually help with decision making, because we need to try to think about what level of evidence do I actually need to make this decision in the real world. Because if you're a personal trainer, let's say, and you're just focused on exercise, you can make exercise decisions for the purpose of enjoyment and for the purpose of adherence without having to justify it with a particular research paper. And that's actually one of the traps that I think people fall into when they start to brand themselves as being quote unquote evidence-based. They try to make every decision based on a specific research paper. And that actually just misses the point here of what evidence we need for different decisions. Because I would argue that while you might want some evidence to inform your exercise programming, like things like basic training principles and what leads to different adaptations, etc., you don't actually need an exercise or a specific research paper to decide between a dumbbell bench press and a barbell bench press, or a squat or a leg press. We don't need research papers for that, because you can actually make decisions in the real world and say, what does your client enjoy more? What's actually going to lead to adherence long term? What feels better for them? Is one exercise causing more or less pain? And that's ultimately where things like personal preferences and practical concerns in the real world start to mesh together with the evidence that we have available to influence your decision making. So there's some kind of opening thoughts. Does that make sense, Paddy? Are we
100%.
clear?
100%. And also, like, just putting it into most people's everyday setting. Now, I know obviously most people who listen to this are probably already into their health and fitness, so they may work in the health and fitness field, personal trainers, nutritionists, whatever else, right? But I also know quite a few people who are just like office workers and stuff that listen to the podcast. They just want to keep up to date with the health and fitness stuff. They like that stuff, right? And in an office setting, it's actually a little bit easier to see this, because it goes across pretty much any career you could think of, right? There's the conservative approach to that job or task that needs to be done, and then there's that more liberal approach to it. And again, it doesn't mean, like, in certain circumstances, one approach is more favorable than another. And I'll give a few examples. So, like, the conservative approach, you go into a job and they're like, we do it like this because this is the way it's always been done, and we know the job gets done then. So this is the standard operating procedure. Do this, then this, then this, right? So that's the conservative person. They're like, this we've always done it like this. Why would we change? And then you come in and maybe you're younger, 20 years younger than the rest of the people in there, and you're like, well, we could actually do it like this because we have this technology available to us, and we have this and this that we could do, and it would shave off 20 minutes from the job and make it easier for everyone. And that would be a more liberal approach, where they're like, can we experiment a little bit? Like, do we have a little bit of leeway with this? Can we actually go out on a limb and change a few things up? I might be wrong, but can we try? I think most people will be familiar with that. And again, just from living your own life, you'll see that sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. And an example of that would be, maybe you work in, I don't know, an electricity plant, and you go, oh, well, we do it like this, and it's always been done like this, and it's always left the electricity running. So can we just have a little bit more of a liberal approach to this, and maybe tweak this and maybe do this? And all of a sudden the power is out for half the fucking country. Like, maybe being conservative there would have been the better approach, right? And obviously, as Gary said, in certain fields, this is more prevalent because it's the the things that can go wrong are more serious in a more immediate point, a more immediate time frame, right? Obviously your power going out if you work in a hospital, and that's probably not exactly great. Now, I presume they have backup generators you would want, so like obviously there is immediacy to that. But if you're, again, like I said, in some sort of drug trial or prescribing drugs to a patient, you don't want to be like, you know what, I was actually reading this paper and there was this very small mechanism that I've no idea like the magnitude of effect, but it seemed to make sense. So we have the standard operating procedure of like, give you this drug and this drug. I don't know, maybe it's for H. pylori or something. You're like, oh, we generally give triple therapy, right? This is the one we do. But you know what? I've actually been reading about, the effects of H. pylori on this other thing. So I'm actually going to give you this trial drug and I'm just going to prescribe it. We'll see how you get on with it. It's like, that would be a reckless approach, and could potentially lead to harm. Like the classic example that they always give with like drugs that lead to harm is thalidomide, when they gave it for nausea to pregnant women and it led to birth defects, and that's, if someone was more conservative in their approach, they were like, maybe we shouldn't use this drug for this side effect of pregnancy, let's say nausea, because then you get the side effect of birth defects, and obviously they didn't know that ahead of time. Well, you would hope they didn't know that ahead of time, or some people were fucked up. But being more conservative in your approach there probably would have been a better idea than being a little bit more liberal and going like, yeah, it actually seems to work for this. We don't really know the longer term consequences of this. It hasn't been as robustly tested as drugs are now. Let's go with it. So for a coaching perspective, or your own health and fitness journey, there are times when being more conservative makes sense. And there's times when being more liberal with what you do makes sense. A really good example is a lot of the stuff that we do with resistance training actually has no evidence base. None whatsoever. There's no evidence base that would suggest that squats are the best exercise for legs, right? And that's not to say that they're a bad exercise, but it's purely convention, purely conservative. Like if you make that decision, you go, oh, I'm evidence-based, please show me the evidence. Right? If you go, squats are the best exercise, like please, I'm intrigued. I love squats, so I'd be like, yes, fuck, I have evidence for this, but there's none. It's purely because of the way resistance training evolved. Like if we didn't create barbells, no one would be saying that squats are the best exercise. We'd have something else. Like if machines came first, we'd be like, oh Jesus, I use the hack squat machine, I don't use that fucking barbell. That's disgusting. So there's like, a lot of the stuff that people say they're evidence-based with is just, there's very little evidence to suggest that that's like, there's pretty much no evidence, right? Yeah. And they're just purely going on convention or that conservative philosophy of like, well, squats have always worked for everyone. Why would I do something different? Whereas again, the more liberal person might be like, all right, well, squats are a good exercise. But based on the, how the quads work, and I'm looking at these, like the anatomy and the biomechanics, especially of this individual in front of me, I actually think a leg press is going to be way more effective for you. You just tip forward in your squat, you feel it all in your low back, and yeah, it's working the quads even in that circumstance. If we can just get rid of that limiting factor and we can actually start taxing the legs, we actually have a better quad stimulus, which is what we're trying to do here, and let's try leg press instead of that, and that's the more liberal approach to it. So you can see there is no right and wrong with this stuff. There is a right and wrong in the circumstance, potentially, especially if it is, the drug trial, or like Ari said earlier on, public health policy. You want to be more conservative. You don't want to be like, yeah, how confident, like someone asks you how confident you are in this approach, you're like 50%, I think it might work for people, like you don't want that in a public health approach where you're giving information to the vast majority of people. You don't want that, because again, all that becomes then is the conservative approach going forward. you know, and that does influence both the results people get. You know, if you make, I don't know, recommendations for health and fitness stuff in terms of nutrition, you're like, this is what we should do. Like that affects people's lives potentially for the rest of their life, you know, and it also impacts on public, you know, policy going forward, because they're like, oh, well, you know, we'll subsidize this like grain production and we'll do this because we're actually trying to recommend this and it seems to be effective for this, you know, and it goes way down the rabbit hole. And then in 10 years time, you're like, the conservative approach is an approach that is wrong, and it's just conservative now because someone was a little bit more liberal with their thinking earlier on. It doesn't mean that it was the best approach forever, you know. Like I always look at it like you probably heard of like nuclear winter, you know. People were really scared in, you know, the Cold War era of nuclear winter. There is literally so little evidence that nuclear winter would occur that if you were following the evidence, you'd be like, what? Like, what? Why would we think this, right? But our public policy is based on that. For like they did it basically. You get a lot of soot in the air or soot in the atmosphere, and they're like, oh, it would cause global warming, but they just don't factor in like soot or like black rain effectively, and then also all of the models use like a spring or summer time approach. So that would be the most impactful, but you know, who's to say it would occur then? So there's a few different flaws with it. I'm not saying that like I'm against nuclear winter having never occurred. You know, potentially there would be a nuclear autumn that would potentially occur. But what I'm saying is, you know, someone came up with that. They were a little bit more liberal. They were like, I'm actually against, you know, nuclear arms, nuclear proliferation, which, you know, that's your right to be against that. And they came up with this theory. They're like, oh, well, like, I think this makes sense. This is what would occur. Because obviously we don't know. It hasn't happened. So we're coming up, we're like, let's be a little bit more liberal. Let's be a little bit more creative, curious. Let's think of some things that would happen, you know? And then that goes down. Like, I don't think there was malice or, you know, harm or anything in like intent in the thinking of it. But that then becomes the conservative approach. We're like, oh, Jesus, that's actually influencing our policies, how we think of things, how the public thinks of things. And it's led to things like, you know, we don't have nuclear power plants, you know, even though they are more well, cost effective, we'll say, but also energy efficient, you know. And it's like, that influences things going forward, you know. And obviously you're entitled to your own beliefs on that. I'm just saying what I believe. But you know, it does have knock-on effects going forward, having either a conservative or a liberal belief. And what's really like almost insidious about it is you can start with a liberal belief that goes against the norm, and then that becomes the conservative. But that doesn't mean that that liberal belief was correct at the start, you know, like just changing, oh, we always do it this way, let's change it to this way. That doesn't mean that it was the best way to do things. And then those knock-on effects, you're putting out fires that never needed to actually occur. And then a new liberal belief, you know, they're challenging the status quo, maybe even goes back to what was previously done because ultimately it was more effective. Another good example would be, you know, moving the dollar away from the gold standard. You know, a load of people are like, yeah, that's a great idea because you can effectively have unlimited credit, right? But that effectively also makes unlimited debt, right? So we're in a situation where a lot of people argue that we should go back to the gold standard. You know, it made sense and we thought it was a good idea. But now we're like, a lot of people, not everyone, are like, oh, let's go back to the gold standard. We should be pegged to the gold, you know? And again, that can happen. And you, as an individual, you shouldn't necessarily fight that. You know, and what I mean by that is you shouldn't necessarily fight that in your own belief system. Like maybe you did believe something about a dietary approach or a training approach or a health topic or whatever, you know, and you're like, oh, I'm going to be more curious. I think this pathway, or I think this, and maybe whatever this, like you could just be wrong, right? Even though you're trying to be curious, you know, and you're trying to figure things out and you're trying to see little potholes and holes in the logic and whatever else. With that approach, and you come up with this other thing, it might be wrong, right? And this is unfortunately one of the things that happens in academia. People are afraid to be wrong, you know, like they won't admit when they're wrong, you know, or and you see this as well, especially in the health and fitness field, where people will effectively do something, propagate a lie or a myth or whatever, and then it'll be disproven, and they'll effectively just slowly distance themselves from ever having said that, even though like they built their name on it, or they have multiple videos and articles and whatever else on that topic. And you're like, anyone who's looking at this can see that you used to believe X and now you don't. And now you're pretending that you didn't change your beliefs on that, you know, or that your beliefs were different in the past, you know, in terms of like, you're like, oh, I didn't actually believe that, even though these words that you're reading from this article that I wrote say that, you know. And like, it's okay, you can be wrong, like anyone can be wrong, it's perfectly fine, you know. And like, obviously we want to maximize the rightness that we are, but it happens, you know. You can be like, you have to be able to push that window. This is why people get tenure in like academia, so they know that their job is secure, they're not going to lose their job, so they can be a bit more curious. So before you have tenure as a professor or as an academic, you're going to be like, all right, I'm going to be very conservative, I know I'm not going to rock the boat, we're going to stay straight and narrow, right? And now I have tenure, I'm pretty secure in my job, I can be a little bit more liberal. I can, you know, look for this approach, and I can look for this approach, and maybe put my neck on the chopping board a little bit here because I actually think this is right, you know. So again, the way you navigate these things can change from liberal to conservative. Obviously not the political version of those things, but can change from liberal to conservative based on the situation in front of you, and then also based on, you know, what else is going on in your life, and you know, your thought process with things. Again, an example that most people can really resonate with is earlier in their life, you know, they, especially as a guy, you might be like, oh, I really want to improve my body composition, I want to build muscle, and you're willing to try so many different things. You're like, oh, it might help, right? But then as you get older and you're like, maybe I should be thinking about my health and longevity a bit more. You know, I have kids now, or I want to have kids, or whatever. And you're like, maybe like I shouldn't take that random supplement that's only been out for a week. Yeah. You know, and I gotta wait until I have, you know, more evidence that this is effective. You know, I'm not going to waste my money on it, but I'm also not going to risk my health on some random supplement. You know, so like through your lifespan, you can see how things change. And I think being dogmatic with your approach and looking at other individuals and thinking like, oh, they are far too liberal for my liking in their approach. Right? I'm not saying their actual political beliefs, but in their approach, you're like, oh, I don't like how they always are talking about this mechanism or that thing or whatever. I don't like that, right? So I'm only going to follow these conservative people. Just remember that those conservative people that have this conservative approach, a lot of the time there's very little evidence for that, and they're literally just doing what has always been done. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong, but that doesn't mean that it's the most effective or best approach to things. And you might find that every so often that person that has these way more liberal beliefs comes up with a little idea that, you know, all of a sudden transfers over into the conservative, and it's like, oh, that's, yeah, we just always do that now, it makes sense, you know. So yeah
and I think you can see some quite good examples of this in medicine in general, like how medical conservatism is kind of being encouraged, is implemented, and is becoming increasingly more popular over time, because there's basically always a trade-off between, like, let's say, like I would say that the conservative will basically end up coming up with more false negatives, so they might basically miss out on interventions that could potentially be useful, you know. So for example, if I'm quite conservative in terms of the dietary prescriptions that I give to the clients I work with, then there might actually be cases where I didn't make a decision to put them on maybe a keto diet, let's say, that could have actually been really beneficial for them, but I'll only find out in future. So there was a potential for false negatives there. Whereas the liberal, they're more likely to encounter false positives. So they're more likely to encounter implementing interventions that turn out in the future to actually have been useless, you know. And that's something that's actually not what you want in something like medicine, let's say, because you don't want to find out 10 years after or 20 years after that you actually just gave people loads of medicines all along that were actually turned out to be really harmful, and you did so in the absence of evidence to support their efficacy, you can see where problems will start to arise then. And you see that in medicine with things like screening tests as well. So the person who might be more liberal and is saying, hey, this kind of makes sense, let's just go ahead and go for that, they might say, oh, why don't we just screen everyone for everything? So why don't we all just get full body MRIs every single year to just make sure that nothing is going wrong? Whereas the more conservative individual will say, well, we don't actually have evidence that improves care for people. And if you screen certain populations in some contexts, let's say cancers in elderly individuals, let's say, sometimes if you're screening for those cancers, what can end up happening is the person actually ends up undertaking lots of investigations and potentially lots of treatment that doesn't actually impact their quality or quantity of life in the end, because it was unlikely to affect them before they died anyway. So you can see how just doing more isn't always beneficial. And obviously, another quite popular medical example would be the multiple drugs that have been put forth for COVID-19 since the pandemic started. You've probably seen lots of hyper politicized discussions about different drugs and stuff like that. And again, you see that battle there between the more conservative approach, where we say, hold on, can we please wait until we have good randomized control trials before we go ahead with this? And individuals who are like, no, we need to get this stuff as soon as possible out to people. There was even an article, I think, in the New York Times last week or the week before, where someone was making the case that we need to fast track the vaccines and get them out to people as soon as possible. Whereas the conservative answer to that would be, if you're going to do that, can you imagine the backlash from conspiracy theorists and anti-vaccine people when they realize that a vaccine has been fast-tracked, and if there did happen to be harm associated with that because it wasn't rigorously tested? Like, that is a nightmare for public health and for medicine and for public trust in professionals or healthcare professionals in general. So you can see how there are these trade-offs. And as I was saying to Paddy before the podcast started, like, you do actually want people who are more conservative in their thought process and people who are more liberal in their thought process. So if we were to create like some sort of research group for nutrition science, let's say, you'd want people in the room who are going to say, hold on a second, slow down, right? We have no evidence to support what you're saying. We have these trials that support this, this, and this. So where are you getting these ideas? And then you want the person across the room who's actually saying, hold on, look, right? If you look at the biochemistry of this molecule, it seems like this interacts with this receptor, and it would make sense that this phytonutrient in this food could potentially affect that. I think it's worth at least trying to investigate. And, they might go ahead and spur future research. And then there might be basic science evidence that supports the idea that, oh, this might potentially help in humans in the future. Whereas that actually has to go through multiple different steps to eventually lead to the conclusion that, oh, this actually helps people in the real world in foods as consumed. And then the conservative individual might turn around and say, okay, you were actually right in this case, so let's move forward with that. So you do need that. Like, another example would be something I reshared in my Instagram a couple of days ago. Was basically just this kind of this genetic defect in a particular gene that leads to familial hypercholesterolemia. And basically that gene, from its discovery of its role 10 years ago, it took 10 years for it to translate into a drug that was proven in the real world to actually make a difference to these patients. So you actually need that 10-year period to be able to rigorously test it to make sure it works in the real world without adverse effects. Because if you were overly liberal in that context, you could say, hold on, we've identified the problem in these people, let's treat it immediately. And then you could end up with adverse effects, and that obviously wouldn't be what you want, especially if mass produced. So I think it should be pretty clear that in a lot of cases with the medical side of things, you probably do want to be a bit more conservative, especially as you begin to factor in like economic considerations. Like, for example, if you're working in a socialized healthcare system, you want to make sure that you are allocating your resources appropriately. Like, if you're just going to screen everyone, let's say, and that's going to have huge costs on the healthcare system, and it's not clear that it's making care better, then that's probably not something that you want. So again, you're moving towards the conservative end of the spectrum. However, as we move to something like exercise, because I've actually been asked this in the past, that I have, someone has commented that I have quite high standards of evidence for some things, but then when it comes to some exercise interventions, I seem to be kind of a bit more free flowing, you could say. And that's true, because like I'm very open to my clients doing a variety of different exercise, a variety of different types of programs, rep ranges, etc. Like if you've ever read our exercise related content, or you've heard us discuss exercise on the podcast, like I don't really care in many cases whether someone does 5 reps or 30 reps. Like, yes, it might make a slight difference, but I mean, overall, like those rep ranges will regularly feature in programs that I give to clients. Do most programs feature mostly kind of 8 to 15 reps? Yeah, probably, like for most people, but I'm still happy to deviate beyond that. And the reality is that when it comes to exercise and things like how many reps should I do, or what rep tempo should I use, or should I do squats or leg press, we don't actually need loads of rigorous trials to give us answers to that. We need to know that we're in the ballpark. That's the reality. Because for most people, when it comes to exercise, the outcomes that we're measuring are chronic adaptations. They're adaptations that are associated with this person being consistent and putting in the effort consistently over years and decades. Particularly as we look to health, we already know that the vast majority of people do not meet basic exercise guidelines. Therefore, if you were someone who's trying to allocate public health resources in terms of research funding, let's say, no offense, but I would not give my funding to someone who's investigating leg extensions versus leg press. Like, that might be of interest to me personally, but from a public health perspective, who cares? It's just not a big priority, because people aren't even satisfying the basic requirements. So obviously, like, there's some sports science researchers listening who are like, oh, we already find it hard enough to get funding. You don't need to make it harder for us. But clearly there is a priority there. There's a hierarchy there in terms of what you might want to fund, and the potential benefits that could be associated with that. So what I would say to people when it comes to deciding on exercise, I think you have more freedom to use like basic reasoning and personal preferences, etc., than you might do with something like prescribing a medicine. Obviously, those things like personal preference and patient consent, etc., still factors into those decisions. But with exercise in particular, with something where adherence is a pretty large barrier and enjoyment is so incredibly important. And I don't mean enjoyment in the sense that everything needs to be fun, but at least that the person's like, yeah, like I like coming in and doing these exercises. These feel better than the other exercises, so I'm going to do them. I think when it comes to exercise, that stuff just becomes far more important. And I think, even things like, let's say, the use of resistance bands for something like a reverse banded squat or a reverse banded hack squat, let's say, like, do we have evidence to support that that's beneficial for muscle building or strength? I wouldn't say there's very rigorous evidence. In strength, you can make some cases. In hypertrophy, I'm like, oh God, it's hard to make the case based on rigorous evidence. However, I personally view that as being an area where I can be a bit more liberal, because I can say to my clients, how give it a shot there, try to put bands on this exercise, see how it feels. And if they come back to me and say, oh man, my chest was absolutely on fire, I felt it way better than I normally do, and normally my shoulders always at me at the bottom of the bench press, and it actually wasn't when I used the bands, then I have enough evidence there from their feedback to say that this is a potentially useful intervention for this individual in this context. What you generally will not see me say is that, oh, you need to band every exercise, and that's something that's useful for everyone all of the time. However, you can make cases where that is the case. So I think that's a good example of a type of decision that you might make that is a bit more liberal, and you're not being too conservative with your decision making, because there's a potential to influence your client's experience and potentially their results. And that's particularly useful in the case of pain and injury, because often in the case of pain and injury and in a rehab context, we actually don't really have evidence to support specific exercises. There are some like rare cases, like let's say in hamstring rehab, the Nordic hamstring curl has been researched extensively. However, for the vast majority of cases, like there's just not really evidence there to say that you should to these exercises for knee pain, and for good reason, because we don't have a reason to believe that there are particular exercises that would be more or less beneficial or that you would need to prescribe. So if I have a client who's coming to me and they have knee pain, let's say they have a patellar tendinopathy or something like that, then I feel I have a lot of freedom in terms of my decision making. Like, there's evidence obviously that points you in the direction of what you need to do, but it's a very loose recommendation. And that recommendation might be something like, you should do knee extension focused exercises. But that's a very, very loose recommendation. So still within that, there's potential for being more liberal as you decide between leg extensions and leg presses, and whether or not you use bands on that leg press. And for example, if I was in a coaching context, I might, get my client, they hop on the leg press and they say, Gary, look, this feels fine. I'm able to do it. But at the bottom, it's really stressing my knee more than I'd like. My knee's really at me. So if I add something like resistance bands in that context, then what I'm doing is I'm using my reasoning, my prior knowledge to modify the resistance profile of the exercise. And then the person feeds back and says, that actually feels much better because the resistance is now, it's different. It feels a bit lighter at the bottom, a bit heavier at the top. And now that person can continue training through their rehab process. We don't have evidence to support that, but you can still make the decision. And I think that should hopefully make it clear why you have to have different frameworks for decision making depending on the issue that you're dealing with. I'm going to be I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable about, recommending nutrition interventions to my clients who, let's say, if I have a client with ulcerative colitis, let's say, and they say they're with me like fat loss response on, things like calories and macros and personal trainer specific stuff. I'm like, cool, that's no problem. We can work with that. However, if that client turns around and says, what diet do you think I should do to heal my ulcerative colitis? That's an area where I have to actually step back and say, not only from a scope of practice perspective, but from an evidence perspective, I have less freedom to actually make decisions there because I have to be conservative. I don't know what the potential harms are. Like, for example, if you could say that maybe that individual, if they go on something like a carnivore diet, let's say, and they actually have, let's say, improvement in their symptoms briefly for a short period of time. If I do that and I'm more liberal in my approach and I don't have evidence to support that, I mightn't actually be aware that there could be unknown harms. Like, for example, down the line, potential, maybe because they're missing certain phytonutrients or polyphenols or fiber or whatever, that actually leads to worsening of their condition and more adverse outcomes in the long term, higher rates of things like having to have their colon removed or surgery or whatever. Like, I can't know that in advance. And if I'm using solely their symptoms as my means of feedback and decision making, that can be actually potentially dangerous in those situations. So yeah, there is a spectrum here, and you need to consider what evidence you need on the basis of the specific decision that's being made. And then you need to consider, is there an asymmetry here, an asymmetry between benefits and harms? Because if it's more likely that there's going to be a benefit and there's very low risk of there being harm of the intervention, like using bands on a leg press, please feel free, go ahead. But if you're talking about nutrition interventions for specific medical conditions that could have adverse effects, we have to be more conservative, So I think that contextualizes it a bit.
Yeah, 100%. So how do you as a coach or an individual, how do you navigate this entire landscape? Like, how do you know when to be liberal and how do you know when to be conservative? Because, like, let's just take it like this. The conservative approach is probably the safer approach, I would say, right? Because you're doing what's always been done. You're not going against the consensus, right? Now, I say safer, that's not always the case. For example, even in the exercise context, you might be just choosing exercises because those are the exercises that have always been done, and you have an individual in front of you who's just, they're just not built to do that exercise, and it's almost 100% likely that they're going to have harm as a result. Like, they're doing a bench press and they get it halfway down, and that's as far as they can actually go with their shoulders in a good place. And you're like, no, you must touch your chest, and they're like, da, da, da. And you can see that they're just moments away from snapping all kind of rotator muscles, right? But you're like, well, this is the way it's always been done. So if we take it that generally the conservative approach is a safer approach, is that where we start? Do we start with the conservative approach and then we start looking at, all right, we have this theoretical knowledge, you've read all of our articles, you're in the coach's corner, you're getting all that information, and you have theoretical knowledge, or at least a lot of it, right? So you're able to make good, we'll call it evidence-based decisions, right? Um, do we then just start tweaking things? We're like, oh, we can be a little bit more liberal here, and maybe a little bit more liberal here and here, but we should definitely keep this pillar here as like a conservative pillar. Like we obviously don't want to change multiple things at once, but also this, it probably makes sense to keep this as a very conservative pillar of what we're trying to achieve. I don't know, maybe we'll say it's nutrition. You're just like, well, I'm not going to just recommend some random diet when you haven't even mastered, getting an appropriate calorie diet, so like, how do we navigate this? Do we just stay conservative until we have reason to believe that a looser, more liberal approach to a certain thing is good? Or do we start with maybe a template that's conservative, and then we bring in liberal stuff from the start? We're like, based on just looking at this individual, I think this exercise or banning this or doing this, and having a little bit more of a deviation from what's always been done. Do we just start out with that? Like, how do we approach this?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think that's a good framework to work with, because like I think an example of this, a good one is nutrition, right? So we get someone on board and they're initially, they're just looking to get their diet in order. And I initially say to them, okay, we're going to start off with a protein recommendation that seems reasonable within the ranges we normally recommend. So let's go 2 grams per kilo. Fat, let's start maybe around 1 gram per kilo, and then let's fill the rest of your calories with carbohydrates. And then I'll give them some guidance on, what foods might want to make up those calories and carbohydrates and proteins and fats, etc. And then maybe we review after week 1, and we move forward with like that for a few weeks. And that's my conservative starting point, because I know that those recommendations are taking care of my clients' needs in the vast majority of cases, and it's a diet pattern of moderation, and there's a lot of flexibility within that. So as we move forward, then let's say over the first 4 weeks, what I begin to observe is that on average, this individual seems to be way overshooting the fat target and way undershooting the carbohydrate target, and their feedback to me is that I feel much better when my carbohydrates are a bit lower and my fat's a bit higher. It also suits my taste preferences. And because of where I'm from, the cultural standards of the foods that we eat aligns very much with this sort of macronutrient breakdown. So in that case, I'm going to be like, okay, cool. Let's actually begin to move in that more liberal direction or freedom direction, where we begin to say, all right, I'm going to give you freedom to actually, create a diet structure that's more appropriate for you. And we begin to move in that direction. And then the person, they're at 150 grams of carbs now. And then, another 4 weeks and they're like, I actually want to bring my carbs down lower and my fat up higher. And it's like, okay, yeah, right. Now we're at 100 grams of carbs. And as that process continues, there comes a point where I'm like, okay, I actually need to pull this back in. I need to be a bit more conservative, because what I'm seeing in this individual is that the vast majority of their fat intake seems to be coming from, let's say, butter and bacon fat. There's very little diversity there. It's mostly saturated fat. And as I begin to look at their carbohydrate intake, they're kind of just getting a few extra grams of carbs from like sweets and stuff that they have around their workout, and their fiber intake is quite low. So as I look at that, the person might come back to me and say, I'm actually feeling really, really good. I've felt this good in ages. Their weight loss is going really well. However, that's where I have to bring in that kind of conservative perspective and say that, look, I don't actually know 100% whether or not this is doing you harm. However, based on the evidence that we have available, it's probably not a great idea for most of your fat to be coming from saturated fat and for your diet to be really low in fiber. So could we kind of meet somewhere halfway? So I might say to someone, look, let's try and at least get your fiber up to 30 grams a day. And could we bring that saturated fat down a bit? Just so maybe instead of some bacon, 3 evenings a week, I'd like you to have something like salmon, or I'd like you to have some olive oil instead of butter, or these types of things. We start to make some subtle adjustments so that we can still use the the more liberal element where the individual has had the freedom to play around with their diet and to do something that's a little bit different from my standard recommendation. But I'm also kind of coming back to those conservative pillars of what I think a good diet pattern looks like. And then we kind of meet in the middle. So that's how I would look at it. I would say we start more conservative or just general. You get more specific to the individual by using their feedback in a kind of more liberal manner. But then you always have those kind of conservative pulls that you hold yourself to and that you try and pull yourself back to. Because like, I think what people need to realize is that it's almost always sexier in any domain to be that more kind of liberal individual, the individual who's willing to deviate from convention, to kind of move to newer things based on something that might be useful. That's always sexy because it's new and because it's novel. However, the benefit of being more conservative with the evidence that you use is that you come back to kind of what's tried and trusted and what's likely to be most useful. And the thing is, that's not always going to sell well. And that might even be the case for your clients. So your clients might actually say to you that, oh, but I want to try out this new diet. I actually enjoy this more and I'm feeling better. So that's ultimately where I think something like education becomes really, really important. And it goes back to what we discussed in the last podcast on collaborative decision making. If you can inform the individual why you are being more conservative, it demonstrates the fact that you actually do have concern, you've thought deeply about this, you've educated yourself on the topic, and then it's more likely that they're actually going to be willing to rein things in a bit. So that's what I would say. Other examples of this would be in the nutrition context, something like a more IIFYM, or if it fits your macros approach to dieting, let's say, or the extremes of flexible dieting. So like I said, if I give someone the initial calorie and macronutrient recommendations and they come back to me and they're hitting the targets, but their food quality is just awful, so they kind of they hit their protein, but they do it by just throwing in a few shakes and protein bars, and their overall diet pattern is primarily processed foods, junk foods, hyperpalatable, high calorie foods, lots of sugar, lots of refined carbohydrates. They're not cooking anything, lots of packaged foods. Like, as I look at that, I'm thinking, okay, look, you are satisfying the needs in terms of hitting your calorie and macronutrient targets. And yes, you are going to lose weight and move towards your body composition goal with that approach. However, I'm concerned long term that this is actually a recipe for disaster when it comes to adhering long term, especially as you get leaner. Things like satiety become more of a concern. As you accumulate more and more years on a diet pattern like this, we might be concerned about nutrient insufficiencies. We might be concerned about adverse metabolic health effects. So I don't think this is the best approach for you. So again, you're starting conservative. You're saying that, okay, you're giving the person freedom and flexibility, but as they take that too far and become a bit too liberal in their approach, you need to, again, be able to rein it back in, be able to become a bit more conservative. And that's where you need to take things. And one final example, just as it relates to exercise, because I said previously that it's a good idea to be a bit more liberal with your exercise approach. However, again, it's not you can only take that to a certain degree, because let's say we're making designing a program for someone and I tell them that there's quite a bit of flexibility that they have, and we don't have that much evidence to support specific periodization models or whatever, or different programs. However, we have evidence for basic principles. I might start someone off on, right, let's say we're doing a 4-week block, 4 days per week. They've got fixed exercises that they're doing each day, maybe one exercise per day. I give them autonomy to make their own decision. And we've got rep ranges, etc. And they come back at the end of 4 weeks and they actually say, look, Gary, actually, for the last 2 weeks, I decided to just change all the exercises because, there's no evidence to support, like, I have to do just one exercise. So I kind of just change them around each workout. And that again would kind of bring you back to my more conservative principles and saying that it's probably more likely that if we repeat exercises each week, that you're going to get more of a benefit from them by gaining the skill and ensuring that we're moving past basic motor learning or neurological adaptations. So we need to kind of repeat those exercises each week. And look, I know you've been kind of just randomly hitting rep targets, but I do think we should kind of maintain some sort of rep range that we work in. So again, what I'm doing there is bringing it back to a more conservative approach while still allowing for some freedom. So what I might say to that individual, if they feel they benefit from more autonomy in their programming and more flexibility and being more liberal there, I might give them broader rep range targets, maybe on a couple of exercises, and maybe 2 exercises at the end of each workout, I give them autonomy. So it could be something like, all right, autonomous bicep exercise of choice and tricep exercise of choice. Because, you know, like, what are you going to do? Like, you're going to do an easy barbell curl or a dumbbell curl. Like, they're just not that different. Whereas something like a squat and a leg press, they actually are quite different. And if you've been doing leg press for a while and you go back and do a squat, you actually kind of feel like Bambi, you know, you Bambi on ice kind of thing. You're not real coordinated. You don't have those adaptations. So you're only ever getting back to your baseline level of strength as opposed to actually progressing strength. So yeah, I think that gives people a framework to think through these problems. What do you think?
100%, Gary. I actually have nothing else to add. I think that effectively does cover everything.
I think
And
so.
I think people will come away from this thinking, again, there is no one approach. You can
No.
definitely be safer and just follow the conservative, like what has always been done, and effectively use templates. But at certain points with certain individuals, you're going to have to bring in some more freedom, some more allowance to deviate from that conservative thought process, because as I said earlier on, a lot of the stuff, it's just convention. There's actually no evidence to suggest it, to suggest it, yes, to fully, throw your hat in and be like, this is the number one, or this is the best, or this is what we should recommend on a population-wide scale, like there's very little evidence for that, especially in the context of resistance training. There is a little bit more in the context of nutrition. We have a little more robust knowledge around, this is how much like fat we need, this is how much protein we need. However, if you've read my articles on those topics as well, you'll realize that a lot of the times the evidence isn't actually even that strong, or numbers seem to make sense based on, we'll say proxy measures down the line, right? But we don't have a direct, like, this is the evidence that suggests this is the number, like, for example, we always use the kind of pretty conservative fat recommendations of like 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo of body weight as your fat per day, right? But if you actually try to like dig in and be like, where are we getting this from? Like a lot of it is somewhat mechanistic and somewhat like down the line. It's like, oh, well, if we go below 0.6, people find it hard to, stick their diet. They find like it's not as palatable. They find like it's hard to adhere to. They also notice potentially some, endocrine stuff in certain circumstances, like hormonal stuff. And you're just like, like, I don't have a definitive, like, oh, is it 0.59? Is it 0.6? Is it actually 0.5? Like, and for some individuals, is it actually lower? Like maybe you can get lower and you find you have no issues, and it's the same with like the omega-3 intake, like we have a lot of research to suggest that omega-3s are good, obviously you can overconsume them as well. But, the actual definitive number, it's very hard to be like, this is the exact amount you need to be getting daily, or again, like fat targets you can look at weekly because you can store fat. But it's very hard to dial in on very specific numbers, and we're left with like mechanistic stuff, or studies that somewhat arbitrarily used an amount, and now that's the amount that we have. Like they say they just use like 3 grams of omega-3s, and you're just like, all right, I don't know, like, could you have gotten all the benefits that are associated with this study from 2 grams? Is there more if we go up to 10 grams? Like we don't have that robust information, right? So we have to use the mechanistic stuff, the data that some liberal person generated. Like they were like, I think these are good. This is what I'm going to go with. This is not included in the general recommendations, the conservative approach, but I'm going to test something out. Oh, we see benefits from this. Now we have a number to work from. That doesn't mean that it's the be all and end all. And as I said at the start of this, a lot of the stuff is convention, and you have to be willing to put your neck on the line and be a little bit more liberal in your approach sometimes, especially as a researcher, when you have tenure, to be able to go like, oh yeah, like I'm actually going to test this amount. Is this better than this? Or there's this mechanism here. Maybe we'll actually bring in a nutrition protocol for this, and oh, it actually works, or no, it didn't work. Like, and then that just becomes the conservative approach because it works. Like an actual brilliant recommendation, I was thinking of it earlier, I didn't say it, when you were talking about medicine, is there's always the line of like conventional medicine, when they discuss functional medicine. They're like, look, if it works, it is medicine. Like if something works in a functional medicine approach, like like they have a protocol or whatever, that just becomes medicine. And there may be a lag time, or there might be a different thought process in how you navigate a situation. Like, again, a conventional medical practitioner might be more willing to utilize drugs. I'm straw manning the argument here, but they might be more willing to utilize drugs, whereas the functional medicine doctor might be like, well, let's actually look into these other things before we even think about that approach. So, like, if it works, it becomes the thing. That becomes the conservative approach. Although sometimes, again, that's like, it is self-correcting over time. However, that doesn't mean it's self-correcting over your lifetime. It could be like 100 years in the future, that it actually gets corrected, and you're like, oh, right, that would have been nice to know. Basically, there's a time and a place to be conservative with your approach. There's a time and a place to be a little bit more liberal with your approach, and there is no right and wrong with this stuff. It's not like politics. Like, I always use the politics lens with this, in terms of people like to say they're a centrist, but when they're actually saying they're a centrist, what they really mean is they're a conservative, right? And the reason I say that is because their view of centrism is, well, let's just keep the status quo, which is actually conservatism. Not necessarily like the actual political, like, conservative parties or liberal parties, totally. But the actual approach itself, the thought process, which is what we're talking about today, is a conservative thought process. So like, oh, well, why would we change the status quo? Like, let's not have a dichotomy of this or that. Let's just keep doing what we're doing, which is actually a conservative approach. And also in politics, like, people who would classify themselves as conservative don't actually have conservative approaches. For example, an easy one to say, and it's a more liberal belief in terms of political liberal belief, that the liberal people are more concerned about the environment, right? And if you think about it, you're like, if you're a conservative and you're not concerned about the environment, what are you concerning? What are you conserving? Like, so even though they're called conservatives, they're not actually being conservative, right? But also, we have to remember that even if you are a centrist and you have that belief that you're like, oh, I just want to keep the status quo, that is conservative. However, sometimes, and this applies to politics, it applies to how you approach training, nutrition, how you approach this whole thought process that we've been thinking about, sometimes that centrist approach is just as bad as one or the other approaches. And what I mean by that is, like I always use the example, if the liberal says, like, the liberal approach is, I think we should eat this log of shit, and the conservative approach is, Jesus Christ, no, I'm not eating this log of shit. The centrist goes, oh, I ate half that log of shit, so we're all good. Like, that's not a good approach, right? So if you are doing, like, bringing a conservative or liberal approach to your training, like, don't get caught in that position where you are effectively doing the worst of both worlds. You're keeping some things conservative, which, maybe it would be better if we were a little bit more liberal there. Maybe you're just very dogmatic in terms of, oh, everyone must squat, bench, and deadlift, right? But you're more liberal in other areas, which potentially it would be better if we were more conservative. For example, you're like, yeah, of course, go this super high fat carnivore diet, that's great, and it's like you're being more liberal with your nutrition recommendations
Yeah.
and being extremely conservative with your training recommendations, and this doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcomes long term. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't lead to good outcomes. It's very potentially that it does, but we probably would have been better being a little bit more on that, we'll call it the centrist approach, in terms of let's have a little bit of more liberalness in the exercise recommendations. Like, this individual is clearly, not really built to deadlift. Like, they've really struggled to get the bar off the ground. And once it's up like 2 inches, they're like, yeah, I actually feel great, So being a little bit more liberal in your recommendations there would probably be a good thing, and the same with the nutrition, being a little bit more conservative and not saying like, oh yeah, of course, just eat as much saturated fat, eat as much meat as you want, it's all good, like that's probably not a great generalist approach. Again, it might be the approach you take with an individual, and there might be reasons to believe that, but in general, that's probably not going to lead to the best outcomes long term. So again, you have to navigate this liberal versus conservative thought process, but just don't fall into the position where you get the worst of both worlds, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and definitely don't just attach it to your own political beliefs, because you don't want this to leave this podcast and be like, oh, well, I'm conservative politically, so I'm going to become super conservative with all of my recommendations, or vice versa, because very often they actually go in the opposite direction. So yeah, just ditch the American politics kind of terminology for a moment. But anyway, the one other thing I was going to say, because you brought up the kind of the carnivore and the low carb examples, is you can actually see really good examples of where this plays out in the low carb and the carnivore community. Like, an example of this would be your man Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD. He made a post like a few weeks ago, like celebrating his LDL cholesterol of like, I think it was close to like 600, something like that, which is like really, really, really high. Like very, very high. Like it's not probably not good. But his case is kind of like, he's like, well, they haven't studied this in populations like me, so I'm going to be fine. And that is the case of a lot of kind of people in the low carb, high fat kind of keto community. They'll basically say that, yeah, look, LDL seems to be associated with cardiovascular disease in certain populations, but we actually think that it's probably wouldn't apply to us because we're lean and we're healthy, and because we don't have carbs in our diet, or we have low insulin, then it's not going to matter. And that very liberal belief, because basically what they're saying is they're making some sort of mechanistic hypothesis and they're running with it at the expense of like potential serious harm. Because the potential, like when you're talking about something like potentially having a heart attack at 40 or 50, like that obviously becomes really, really important, and you need to cater your decision making to that. And the interesting thing here is that people in the general population, as they observe the discourse between people like that, let's say, and maybe the more conventional medical community, they can often end up quite confused, because the person who is standing up, let's say, for eating a diet that is more rich in vegetables and fiber and etc., and contains carbohydrates, they're not necessarily saying that there's absolutely no possible way that the carnivore diet could improve your health. But what they are saying is that based on everything that we know, it's fairly unlikely that an LDL of 600 is going to be benign. Okay, it's fairly unlikely. So if we can look at someone like that who's on a low carb, high fat diet, and they're eating loads of saturated fat, most of their fat from saturated fat, and their LDL is increasing, and we know that that's generally harmful in the general population, then it makes sense on a medically conservative basis to turn around and say, this probably isn't the best idea based on what we know. The reality is that we can't know everything. And you have to start thinking in terms of probabilities when you get cardiovascular disease 100%. It's a case of probability. So being more kind of conservative in your approach, you accept that, all right, there's certain, based on what we already know, there's an increased probability of certain adverse events with certain profiles, let's say lipid profiles. And as a result, potentially certain diets. And when we make recommendations to the population, we're more likely to sit on the side of what seems to be associated with good health, based on lots of evidence, rather than jumping to something that people who've done it for a few years feel better on, but we don't ultimately know the long-term outcomes. So yeah, there's very clearly a kind of a philosophical difference in terms of how those groups of people approach evidence. And what I would say to you is that while it can be very convincing at times when people present isolated papers that maybe make some plausible mechanisms, you need to be careful with that. Like, for example, sometimes carnivore proponents will make certain hypotheses and say that, oh, look, I know this nutrient is low on a carnivore diet, but we actually think that based on this mechanism, we mightn't actually need as much of that nutrient because we're carnivore. Or the LDL example, LDL mightn't matter as much because we're carnivore, and people on low carb diets, they have different LDL specific types of molecules versus people who are on a standard American diet. But those mechanistic hypotheses, they're interesting and they can take you to a certain point. But if you're thinking about your own personal health or the health of your clients, I think being a little bit more conservative is probably generally a sound idea.
Yeah, I just think moving the goalpost to fit your diet pattern is probably not a great idea.
Yeah, no, it's just not good. And that's exactly what most diet cults do.
Yeah, like again, like you said, like they're like, oh, like vitamin C in the carnivores, they're like, oh, well, we actually don't need as much. And I'm like, okay, that's perfectly fine. But then you have to explain throughout history how people who ate like this got scurvy. Like you have to explain that. If you think this, then tell me, explain this. For example, the pioneers in America, they when they went across like the Oregon Trail, for example, or what was it? What were those two people that explored the west of America? Their name is completely gone out of my head. Anyway, the two explorers, like all their explorers with them and stuff, they were able to catch a load of animals. They were able to catch rabbits. They were able to catch bison, whatever. And because they weren't eating vegetables, they got scurvy. They got a vitamin C deficiency. So they were eating basically only meat. And you look at their journals, they're like, we caught X amount of meat today. We killed this buffalo and we ate it. And they were basically only eating meat because there's like the fruits and vegetables and stuff. Like obviously that's a little bit harder to get in North America where they were going. Anyway, like you might stumble across some berry trees occasionally. But anyway, they got scurvy. So you have to explain that. You have to be able to explain that with your diet pattern, how someone in history ate like you ate or like you eat, or you're suggesting people should eat, and they got something that you are saying is not a concern, right? So you have to be able to explain that if that is the case. The other one as well that they always move the goalpost on is obviously the LDL, but on top of that, especially with the carnivores, they move the goalpost on, the other one that they move the goalpost on is sex hormone binding globulin, right? Because all of these carnivore people, their sex hormone binding globulin goes through the fucking roof, right? And then they're like, and their testosterone goes down. And then they start making these roundabout arguments being like, oh, yeah, this is actually beneficial. Sex hormone binding globulin is associated with, insulin sensitivity, and that's great. That's what we want, right? But then you're like, okay, well, your testosterone is going down. And they're like, oh, it's because we have upregulation in receptors and we have a better ability to handle this. I'm like this stuff, you just start creating all of these issues, and then you start going, oh, well, actually, if we change the definition of this, and if we go through this other maybe potential mechanism, we might be okay, But I'm just like, or you could just eat normally and not have these issues and not have to make any of these random mechanistic things, Yeah, happy days. If you feel better on this type of diet, go for it. But I probably wouldn't be pinning my hat on something that I've moved the goalposts to actually get to, Anyway, we had a few technical difficulties there. Hopefully with the edit that I have done on it, you'll all have listened to that flawlessly. But Gary's going to wrap up the podcast now. So Gary, where can people find us? And I believe we have an announcement to make, because this is going to be coming out at roughly 5 a.m. on a Monday, and at roughly 9 a.m. on this Monday, something is happening.
Yep. So, guys, for most of you who have been following along with the podcast for the last number of months, you'll know that we have been working on a project called the Coaches Corner, which is basically an educational platform designed for personal trainers. Of course, it's open to anyone. If you're an interested trainee, you're more than welcome to join. However, it will be catering for people who have, they've got some level of knowledge already. They're working with people, and ultimately, we're going to be trying to apply theory in practice so that those individuals can go into coaching that day and actually help out their clients, and that will also include a support group, Facebook support group, to actually allow people to present their cases. Right, I was working with this client today, I was having this problem, what do you think we should do? And we'll be creating custom content for those types of issues. So it is going to be very much applied. So if you are interested in that, guys, today is the day that we are going to be launching it. For those of you on the email list, you will be receiving an email to let you know. For those of you who are on the waiting list, you will actually receive a specific discount code to get a discount for the first week. And everyone else, you can sign up today. And basically what that will be is a monthly subscription. And the monthly model is effectively designed so that we're not just releasing a single product and giving you thousands of hours of content to just have to peruse immediately. Rather, what we're going to be doing is releasing a certain amount of content so that people have stuff that's available to consume immediately. And then what we'll be doing is each week we'll be releasing a number of new pieces of content so that you have a couple of hours of content per week, while appreciating the fact that the people who are consuming the content, you personal trainers, you're also at work. You're working all day. You don't have 6 hours a day to be studying. So we're going to be releasing it, drip feeding it out over time, and ultimately trying to build an educational platform that supports your ability to become a better coach, to take on more clients, help more people, and of course make more money. So yeah, that's basically what we're going to be doing, and you can sign up to that today. It will be launching at 9 a.m. So you can sign up then. If you're interested in following us otherwise, we do obviously have our standard Triage Method newsletter, which you can subscribe to. We also have a Facebook group that is open access, so the Triage Method community. If you're interested in joining that, you can also join that on Facebook for free. We also have a YouTube channel, Triage Method, an Instagram page, Triage Method, and a Facebook page, Triage Method again. So if you're interested in any of those, give us a follow. And if you are interested in working with us one-on-one, kind of online coaching, then we do also have spaces available to work with you towards your goals. So get on board if you're interested.
100%, Gary. Anyway, I have nothing else to say. It's too easy.
It's too easy.